And thank you for inviting me for DigiTalk, because it's a pleasure to talk about so many things that came across during my career. I kind of took the opportunity to look back in time and also apply it to what I'm doing now. So what you're going to see in the next 45 minutes are projects which have inspired me, projects where I have been involved. And more in general, it was a good opportunity for me to look back on the fields of interest I'm involved in, because originally I'm an historian, as Anja already mentioned, but I was already, I think, in the early years of my being as an historian, I was already interested in the digital part. And of course, in 1999, digital was still new, hot, and still evolving. And during the 20 years now, I think it has developed into something that, well, you can't imagine the world without digitization at the moment. So this whole process, I think, also well, is reflected by the different projects I've been involved in. At the beginning, very simple digitization projects, and now I will show you some examples of projects we are involved in currently, which I think are unimaginable for me in 1999. So it's constantly developing, and it will be developing in the future as well. So I think we're only at the beginning of a huge development. So what I'm going to do is I will provide a short introduction. I will give some interesting examples, I hope, interesting examples of big historical data and what you can do with that. And then I will focus more on the collection part, because if you look at my career, I'm a big user of collections because, well, I'm also involved in these studies on the Dutch National Socialist movement, but I'm also a kind of involved in creating this data, because I know how important it is for historians to have this historical data. So digitization for me is also a way to create the raw materials for research. And creating these raw materials is somewhere in between research and providing access to collections. And I will show you some projects which are very interesting, I think, in that sense. At the end, there will be an attempt to a conclusion, because, as I said, it's a continuous process. So a definite conclusion, it will not be for sure a definite conclusion, but it will be a preliminary conclusion. And I hope to discuss some thoughts with you and develop some thoughts with you, because I think in my presentation there are a few elements which do not provide a solution, but they provide a sort of thinking. And if you look at that thinking, if you go back to the fact that I'm an historian, I made a very schematic draft. As you can see, it's good that I never become somebody who makes drawings for a profession, because this is the utmost that I can do. But if you look at it, at the top you see the historians. The historians work with the materials in the middle layer. These are source materials. And these can be, for instance, letters. These can be newspapers. These can be archival materials. These can be also audiovisual resources. And these resources are reflections of a reality which is not there anymore. This historical reality that was there is something actually that you try to reconstruct as an historian, but it's not there anymore. So the sources are the things that you are actually using to reconstruct this reality. And I think currently there are spectacular things happening in the middle part, but you will see that the danger is also that you get lost in the middle part, while you still need to realize that it's only a reflection of some of the things that indicate an historical past that is not there anymore. And also the skills of an historian are, of course, in my point of view, that you try to do this reconstruction as clever as possible. So this skill, I think, is still a skill that you also need in digital times. Only, I think, well, your toolbox will become bigger. So I will show you some examples, and in some cases, well, make some remarks about my impressions on these projects. And I think one of the main important things that I learned throughout these 20 years is that we are now moving towards the semantic web. And the semantic web was an idea of I will show you later the definition of that, but the semantic web, the idea of this semantic web is that you learn the computer to understand the text instead of only representing it. And you can do that with ontologies, with certain meaning systems that are connected by different ways. And this is a model, of course, that you probably know. It reflects all these different knowledge systems that are currently available, and they help actually in a way to help the computer to understand words and to interpret words and to make combinations. So in these 20 years, I think we made a movement from web of documents, where you had a web with different documents on it, and you go to these documents, you consult these documents, and that's it. And now we're more and more getting to the data that's on those documents. And I think that's interesting. I mean, the data, the information that's on the carriers is becoming data. And at that moment, there are new opportunities, of course, to connect this data in a sensible way. And I think that's what semantic web is about. I looked up the definition again in the original article. I also included it in the reading list of today. And I think this is one of the most important things that you need to realize, that the power of this concept is huge for historical data, I think. Because what it means, the semantic web is not a separate web, but an extension of the current one, in which information is given well-defined meaning, better enabling computers and people to work in cooperation. And this was in 2001. And now you already see the consequences of this. It's already happening. I mean, if you're working with your mobile and somebody sends you an email and there's a date in it, then your mobile knows that this date will probably have to move to your agenda. So you can it's automated. And a lot of things are automated already because the computer understands the meaning of certain words. And this concept, this semantic web concept, is something I think that's really important. I will show you some more examples of how we apply semantic web to historical collections and link data to each other in a way that you can do things which were normally we were not able to do. And we could also make computers cleverer with this kind of stuff. So basically, if I have to explain this in a very simple way, I used to have a colleague, he was called Rolf, and you see him here at the back of you see him here at work, behind the desk. And if you would ask Rolf, what do you have about the National Socialist movement, Rolf would know everything. So exactly the places in the archives, which photographs there were, which persons I should check. All this information is in his head. And actually what we are doing with the semantic web is trying to get this information in logical systems, which allows the computer to have this knowledge of Rolf in a kind of systematic way and apply it to huge amounts of data. So actually what we want to do is to scan the brains of Roloff. I always make this very awkward joke, but the idea is that you have human knowledge which you want to use to feed to computers to make to help you to provide access to collections. Okay, interesting projects with big historical data. I will show you some examples of projects. Sometimes they are very theoretical, sometimes they're very practical. One of the projects here that you see was about, I think this was interesting because it's an interesting thought experiment. This was a research by Antal van der Bos and some of his colleagues. And it's called Strikes That Never Happened. And what he did is, in a huge amount of newspapers, he picked out the articles on the articles about strikes that were about to happen. So the preface of a strike, and he gathered those articles, and he learned the computer to recognize those articles, to get a kind of DNA of an article of a strike that did not happen. And then he compared it to strikes that did happen. And then of course you can say, well, this strike should have happened. And I really like this experiment because it kind of sets you thinking as an historian. Of course, some people think that these kind of big data research will have some kind of predictability, but of course, as historians, we know that history never repeats itself in the same way. But, and actually what he's studying here were newspapers. He's not studying the reality. So it's important to realize this distinction which I showed you earlier on, that there is a difference between studying resources and the historical reality. But I like this thought experiment. If you would ask me to explain the conclusion of this article, I would not be able to do that. I read it yesterday, but it's too complicated for me because it's all maths in the end. And but I think the idea that you try to look for patterns and at the same time, well, you see also the limitations of the mythology. So here are some Dutch strikers. Well, I think this is a kind of international image. Could be anywhere, probably. And this project is the Venice Time Machine project. And this was a plan put together by some cultural institutions in Venice and also some other parties. And you have to realize that it was a plan. It was never realized because in the end, all the partners, they disagreed about how to do this, and it fell apart. But the idea is something which appeals to me because the ambition is to combine different resources and try to get close to this reality. And of course, you, as I already told you, you can't reconstruct this reality, but I think the combination of resources really shows you the power of linking data. I will show you a short introduction movie. It's kind of, well, of course it's a clip that was meant to sell the project, but it gives you an idea of what it did actually.
Over 1,000 years of history reside in the friary of this church in Venice. Stacked on over 80 kilometres of shelves are maps, manuscripts, monographs, documents recording generations of Venetian bureaucracy. Most of this vast collection has never been read by modern historians, but a new project aims to uncover the secrets of this enormous archive and digitally reconstruct the Venice it describes. The Venice Time Machine project aims to make the huge amount of data stored in the State Archives of Venice accessible to researchers. Every page of paperwork must be scanned and digitised to enable searching and cross-referencing. Normal character recognition software doesn't work well on the wide variety of handwriting found in the archive. So machine learning is being used to recognise word shapes and match them between documents. Cross-referencing names means researchers can create social networks for the city. And the data contained in maps enables them to recreate the building up and occasional falling down of Venice's buildings. Information in maps can then be cross-referenced with historical paintings as well as modern photos. And combining these images with apparently mundane paperwork about shops and businesses means historians can reconstruct the details of the city at almost any point in its history. This virtual time machine should allow modern historians and members of the public to explore ancient Venice. And the written documents could provide datasets on anything from trade and financial markets to public health and the spread of disease. The technology developed for the Venice Time Machine project could be applied to other ancient archives too, creating detailed and inspiring windows into the past.
Another good example of how to use new technology for research by combining metadata that you have on certain resources are these two projects, which are kind of related because they kind of do the same. What they do is they analyze letters from scholars, 17th century, but also 18th century, and they also record who wrote to who at certain moments and where this person was. And I will show you some visuals, but I think, well, unfortunately, I could not find the most important visual, which I once saw in a presentation. But one of the things that they did, for instance, is they kind of, on the basis of a huge analysis of all these scholars in the 17th century, they were able to show the intellectual centers in Europe changing through time, because you could see that some persons moved to different cities and they were writing more to different cities. And I think this was a very clever way of using digital humanities, or of using digital data to do new kinds of research. And things that you could do, for instance, is you could study the correspondence of Voltaire and see to who did Voltaire write, and how often, and what were his main correspondence, and did this change throughout time. And here you have a visualization of the nationalities of Voltaire's French correspondence, and you could also see on the right side their background, their social status, or their profession. And I think this kind of research is very interesting because it really shows the power of having huge amounts of data and do new kinds of analysis. Well, one of the projects I've been involved in, Anja already told you about that, is a big newspaper digitization project. And there are a lot of projects that, digital humanities projects, that are kind of evolved after this this project, because all of a sudden you could search through something like 12 million newspaper pages from different centuries. They had been OCR'd in the beginning, and of course you can imagine then that with 17th century newspapers, OCRing is very troublesome. you don't get very good results, but for the modern newspapers you do. I will show later on in my presentation, I will show that there currently there's also technology available that allows you to do something with the 17th century newspapers. But even something like this, I mean, we made some very simple statistics. These here you can see the pages divided through time, and you see that there's a lot of stuff on it on the Second World War, and that had to do with the fact that that the selection committee thought this to be a very important theme. And I think it's important to realize, and some people who are doing research on this corpus, they don't realize that they are kind of working with a biased corpus. I mean, sometimes it's kind of coincidence why there is a lot on in a certain period. For instance, the fact that there is a lot on the Second World War. Yeah, the selection committee thought it was very important, but there was also more money for it. So that's why you see this peak. And I see some scientists, they don't really take into account this bias, and they just do their research and present it as if this is a representation of all the newspapers that appeared in this period, but that's not the case. And I think that refers back to the remark that I made at the beginning, that you should always use your skills as an historian and be critical of your resources, also with digital resources. On the one hand, you can do far more. On the other hand, you should also take care of the fact that usually you're looking at something biased. So I did a small test 2 days ago to see just a small research question of me was, for instance, there's a Dutch national socialist newspaper. It's called Volk en Vaderland, and I know that it's getting more anti-Semitic throughout time. But I was wondering whether I could see if it's where the big upheavals were, or where the big rise towards another level were. So I did a small research on searching for the Jood, which means the Jew. And normally, if you would use the combination the Jood, it would be an insult. So you know that if this combination is used, it's an insult. And here you can see already that the amount is adding up. And of course, during the Second World War, it really adds up to far larger quantities because of the fact that there is no censorship anymore, of course. Before, in the 30s, there was censorship in the sense that it was forbidden to insult groups, and there was, of course, a legal system that would fight that. And during the Second World War, they were allowed to write almost anything. So you can see that here. And these are really small experiments, but well, it shows also what you can do in a small way. Okay, creating the parameters for such research. So how do we get these collections in a way that you could do this kind of research? We once made this kind of illustration to show what you need to get usable data. And on the one hand, you should digitize it, of course. On the other hand, you should connect it to referable data so that you know that a place mentioned somewhere is really that place. Of course, you have, with a lot of places in Holland, they also appear in the United States, for instance. How do you know which place is which? And you could do that by combining it to the right reference data and using similar reference data. And this is actually very much the semantic web, I think. using similar reference data to know from other resources what they are talking about and to combine that. And this is visualized here in a way. We always called it a raw data factory. But I think it's a good illustration to show the different steps in this process. Well, I'm working now for what's called Netwerk Oorlogsbronnen, and it's a program, it's a network organization of 86 Dutch archives, libraries, museums, and institutes, and they all have Second World War collections, some small, some big, and these can be collections of printed matter, but this can also be archival collections or audiovisual collections, or even object collections. And what we try to do is to digitally connect these data in a sensible way. Like you also saw in this idea of the Venice project, you try to combine different resources in a sensible way so that they provide information in the end. So we focus on who, what, where, and when. And these are actually the most frequent questions that you get when you are dealing with an audience and when you're dealing with the Second World War. And our target audience is not specifically researchers, but also the general public. We want to provide general services with different institutions where people start looking for their family members, what happened to them during the war, or for the place where they live, what happened there during the war, or for certain events or things like that. And we try to refer them to those different institutions. So we have a kind of portal function, you could say. And to do that, we need to, of course, have a lot of digital data, but we also need to have a lot of expertise to how to make those connections. And that's also something that we have been looking for, how to do that. Well, our main website is Oorlogsbronnen, but there's also this other website I will be talking about later on, War Lives. And we're going to integrate them. At the moment, we are actually working on that. But currently, they are still separate sites. So, oh, I already put this here. Okay, well, I'm already going to talk about the War Lives project. And the idea, I think, with War Lives was at the beginning that we knew that there were a lot of institutions that had their own databases on persons. In Holland, you have approximately, I think more than 120 war museums dealing with the Second World War, a lot of them small, and many of them keep name lists or name databases or spreadsheets with names. And for a family member to find out where you can find this information, it was almost impossible, because the only way to do that was to call to those different institutions and ask them, do you have information on my family member? And of course, that was a very inefficient way to do that. So a few years ago, we decided to set up a project with different partners to combine this data and to do it in a way that we would learn the computer to recognize these persons throughout the different data sets. So if there is somebody called Abraham Cohen in dataset 1, how do we know for sure that the Abraham Cohen in dataset 2 is the same person? Well, there are different ways to learn the computer to do that. For instance, if you would know the date of birth and you would know his last name, then you could say something about the probability that this is the same person. So we use this kind of technology, and we learned the computer to do this matching. And we're still learning the computer to do this matching, because, of course, it's a very complicated job in a way. But now the computer, of course, once you've learned the computer to do this, it can do that for huge amounts of data. So here you see this situation where you have different institutions with different collections, and we put those collections together and we start matching, and we start to find the individuals in the different data sets. And this is actually what my colleague is working with. She actually makes kind of approaches or strategies to identify those persons, and they are sometimes really complicated. But once this has been fixed, you can apply it to different data sets, and you can always fine-tune it a bit for specific situations. So that's what she's doing all the time, is fine-tuning it. When a new data set comes in, we do a new approach or a new strategy, and we fine-tune it. So currently we have almost 60 data sets from 31 organizations. It includes 2.4 million names, and we were able to find out we were able to kind of detect those names to 361,000 persons. So there's of course a huge difference between names and persons, because persons appear in many data sets, and if you calculate the number of appearances of those persons, you get, of course, a multiplied factor. We include not only persons who have been persecuted, but also resistance, forced labor, military currently, and we are also planning to include collaboration. But of course, that's a sensitive subject, so we really want to discuss this with the stakeholders, with people involved before we do that. And you can see the results at warlives.nl. There's also an English version of it. And it's actually, we were really, really pleased to win a Grammy Award with this application last year. And what it does, in the end, it makes timelines of these persons. So once we figured out that one person, that those data sets, we found out that this person appears in these different data sets, we try to find the live events of this person. And live events, in our point of view, are actually the important moments. So when you get captured, when you are imprisoned, when you are transported, when you are arrested, these kind of moments. And of course, these are also the moments that you can find in these documents, but they have not been well, you can't use it as data. So we do a lot of stuff in the background to make these timelines in the end. And what you can what it does now is that you can search for a name and you get back people with that name, and you see here that there are 6 sources where all the information comes from. So these are actually the institutes that donated their data to us. And here you can see those live events. Like a live event is if somebody is born or when somebody was arrested. And in this case, this girl was imprisoned in Kamp Westerbork, which is a transit camp to Auschwitz. And she was there for a very short time. And in the end, she was killed in Auschwitz. And we also have some photographs of her. She's actually, maybe some of you know this, but there are moving images of Westerbork where you can see those deportations happening. And it's amazing stuff. It's really frightening stuff, I think, if you look at it. But she's one of the people who looks outside from this carriage. And people were able to find out her name, and there is data on this. So so this is so that's why there's also a biography which you can see at the bottom here. And these timelines are actually automatically created, and if we get in new data sets where her name is mentioned, it will also appear in this timeline. So it's a living thing in a way. Well, things that we are thinking about now is that we want to actually turn around the data, because we have this personal data, but we also want to have data on groups. Like, for instance, who were at Westerbork when she got there? Who were there when she was transported in the same transport? Who were there when she arrived in Auschwitz? And things like that. So we're now thinking of doing more with groups, and also include it in a kind of application like this one. So at the right side you see an example of an infographic which you can make automatically if you've got this data. And you see that since we all gathered so much data, we're getting better at this actually. Well, the theoretical model behind this, which might be interesting for you, is what is called event modeling. So we try to group information around events. And an event is something that happens. So a transportation would be an event, or an assassination would be an event, or an arrest would be an event. And you see that an event has an actor or more actors, has a place, or sometimes even more places, has a moment in time, and you can relate it to a certain concept. So in case of Westerbork, you could relate it to a persecution of Sinti and Roma, for instance, which is a thematic concept. And if you do this with data if you do this in a way that you use linked data, you could use those different entry points to look at the same event from different approaches, from the group, from the individual, from the place, and also from the moment in time. So, for instance, you could say something about what was happening in Westerbork at the moment that she arrived there. And also, as I already told you, the other persons involved. This is another example which I made for a children's deportation from Vught, which was a very sad event where something like 1,200 or 1,300 children were deported to Westerbork, and in the end to Sobibor and Auschwitz. But if you would take that event and you would model it, it would look a bit like this. You have certain actors involved, they have a certain role, you have a time, a moment in time, and you have a place. And if you order you kind of organize the data like this, and you feed the computer or feed software with this, software is able to kind of gather your information on the basis of this concept. And one of the things that we use, and I saw that there were a lot of people from libraries here, and of course people from libraries are very familiar with thesaurus. And what we notice is that the thesaurus for us is crucial. It's very important to have a thesaurus, because that's the glue between the different links that we make. And here you see the example of Westerbork. And the nice thing about thesaurus is, of course, you have all these relations. You know when something is broader and narrower and related, and it's a whole logical system in itself which helps you to do this event modeling in a way. So we kind of discovered this as we went along, because at the beginning it was a very small thesaurus, and now it's growing like it's almost becomes an encyclopedia, but it still does the same thing for us in a way. Another project which I want to highlight, and that's the TRIADO project, which Anja already mentioned. Here you have a photograph, by the way, of the old search system. It's from the 50s. And here you see guys in long coats searching for name cards, I think, which tells them to go to the right part in the archive. So this is actually an index, what you see here, but a very early one, I should say. Well, the TRIADO project in which I was involved, it was an experimental project. It took 2 years. And then we did this with the National Archives, with my organization, with the NIOD, which is an organization of historians, Huygens ING, which is also an organization of historians. So we had a nice combination. The Huygens ING also has technicians and digital humanities specialists. So the digital part was very much in the Huygens part. And the National Archives is the holder of an archive that is called the Central Archive of Special Jurisdiction. And this is, I think, one of the most important Second World War archives in the Netherlands. It contains the files of something like 300,000 presumed Dutch collaborators. And these files are really very informative, because they contain a lot of eyewitness accounts. They have been created very shortly after the war, because, of course, after the war, a lot of collaborators, they had to be tried, and there was this special jurisdiction system set up to do that. And these documents are the proceedings. So there's a lot of stuff in it about what certain persons did during the war, what happened in certain places, and it's a huge archive. It's 4 kilometers, and we did a test on 13 meters. And this archive currently is you can only access it if you know the name of a collaborator, and then you get a huge pile of documents. And that's where you start. And it has not been digitized at the moment. So we were asked actually to investigate what would happen if you would digitize this and also make it machine readable, and perhaps also would apply data enrichment. All in the end, of course, to provide better access to this collection. So we did a little test on 13 meters, and the end result of these tests were very hopeful, I think, because the machine readable text in some cases was not that good, especially with handwritten material, but in case of typed materials, it was very good. And we were also able to pick out names, and to pick out place names, and to pick out dates, and to connect it, for instance, to the thesaurus that you saw earlier on. So it was a very fruitful experiment. And the funny thing is, as we were working on this, there was a lot of new technology developing, and we were not able to use it. But I think some of this technology would be interesting to use if I would, do this project again. I would use different technology. Talking about making things machine readable, I presume you probably are familiar with this, but just a little bit of explanation here. If you got a scan of this, then of course it's not searchable. the computer does not recognize these characters. So you have to apply software, and then you get this, for instance, in this example, and this is machine readable text. And this is the kind of text that you could feed a computer, and this is the kind of text that you could use to provide or to build a search engine, for instance. And even if there are errors in this, and we had an error rate of something like 20%, even with an error rate of 20%, you were still able to get a lot of information out of this. So for instance, in this sample, all the things in red, we could connect to other information. So this was a very interesting experiment, because even with an error rate, it provided a huge step in better access to this collection, if you would apply it to the whole collection. Now, I was already telling you about this new technology evolving. During the project, another project was also running. It was called Transcribus, and it was a European project, and it was about handwritten materials and transforming these handwritten materials into machine readable text. And I can remember I was at the starting conference of this project, and then they were saying things like, oh, we're going to get to a 70% correct, 30% error rate level. And I thought to myself, well, that's never going to happen with handwritten material. It's too complicated. I mean, I can't even, as a human, I can't even read it. So how could a computer learn to read this? I can't imagine. And they started actually with error rates which were far larger than those 30%. So, but after every year, they had a yearly conference. So every year I went to this conference, and every year this error rate got better. And I was really amazed to see that in the last 2 years of this project, or I think even in the last year, they succeeded to get an error rate, a character error rate of 95% for very complicated handwritten material. And I was really amazed. And the way this works actually, and I will show you a clip, so it will be explained also in this clip, but I will try to explain in advance maybe. The way it works is that you learn the computer how to learn in a way. And you do this by feeding it with examples, with perfect examples. So imagine you have a register, handwritten, of let's say in a total of 10,000 pages, and you would use volunteers to type 200 or 300 pages. You could use this to learn the computer to read the rest. And you could learn the computer to translate the rest then after you fed it with this, what they call ground truth. And if you look at the results that you get after you do this, then you really get amazing results. And I think this is really spectacular, because for me, it's I think the first time that I could really imagine that I could Google through handwritten documents. It was unimaginable. I will show you a small clip about this project, which provides you a bit more context.
Wir befinden uns hier im Magazin des Tiroler Landesarchivs. 30 Kilometer an einzigartigen Dokumenten, die das Leben unserer Vorfahren beschreiben. Geburt, Tod, Heirat, Eigentum, Wirtschaft, Militär, Umwelt. Ein Großteil dieser Dokumente ist handschriftlich verfasst. Aber wer kann denn noch Kurrentschrift des 18. Jahrhunderts lesen? Genau das ist nun der Ausgangspunkt für unsere Transkribus-Plattform. Transkribus basiert auf maschinenlernenden Verfahren und kann historische Handschriften wesentlich besser entziffern als 99% aller Menschen in Österreich, mich inkludiert. Aber sie kann das nur, wenn sie genügend Trainingsdaten bekommt, sprich Archivare und Historiker die Möglichkeit haben, die Maschine direkt zu trainieren.
Der Erfolg der Transkribus-Plattform hat uns selbst überrascht. Mehr als 40.000 Personen aus aller Welt haben sich registriert. Dutzende an Forschungsprojekten, aber auch die Nationalarchive aus Finnland, Schweden, Dänemark, England und den Niederlanden verwenden bereits Transkribus. Im Sommer 2019 haben wir deshalb eine europäische Genossenschaft, die ReadCorp SCE, gegründet. Der Gedanke der Zusammenarbeit zwischen Archiven, Universitäten, Familienforschern und der Industrie steht im Mittelpunkt unseres Unternehmens.
Yeah, and one of the, I think it's a very interesting project. One of the things that you mentioned those training models. You could also exchange this training data if you're working with the same kind of handwritten material. You could exchange this training data, and that's happening more and more and more. So, so even if you don't have volunteers, you could still use this data to improve access to this handwritten material. And I think this is an interesting development. Of course, we're not at the end of this development, and it's continuing, and you have situations in which it will provide worse results. But in the end, I think the idea of getting into those handwritten documents, I think it, for me as a historian, it's kind of spectacular. Well, we did not apply this in TRIADO. If I would start this project tomorrow, I would do that. But anyway, what we did at the end of TRIADO is we made a kind of wireframe which shows you what you could do, according to us, with the data after you digitized it, after you made it machine readable, and after you would enrich it the way that we were experimenting with. And it's also an ideal model, so you won't see any mistakes, or not much. And of course, in real life, there will be more mistakes, but it was meant as a kind of thought experiment on where we are heading towards. Because as I already told you, this technology is developing so fast that if we would do the remaining part of this archive, which is of course still a huge amount, then it would take us something like 5 or 6 years. And I'm sure that in 5 or 6 years' time, this technology will be even further. So, so that means that it's a bit of science fiction, but not that much in a way. So if you would search for a name in this archives, for instance, Branka Simons, you would see this name highlighted in the preview, and the original document would be here, and you could connect keywords or special terms from the thesaurus to this special hit. And you would also enable users to make filters on persons found, on organizations found, on events, on locations, on camps, on keywords, on date, and on type of document. We also experimented with identifying types of documents, like for instance, can you identify a specific form? And it was very good at identifying similar forms, actually, because a computer, of course, is very good at pattern recognition. And well, if you get this list with references to different documents, you could also put the results, of course, on maps, for sure. But you could go to document level, and at document level, you could make connections to context information, for instance, from the thesaurus, but also, for instance, from the data that we have in war lives. So you could include these timelines, if a name of a person is mentioned, and if you're able to identify this name in this corpus. Well, that's quite complicated, but it's something that, again, requires fine-tuning. And you could also show source materials related to this archive from other archives, and also related literature. This person wrote a book after the war about her staying at Westerbork. So you can, well, actually, this is, I think, where we're heading towards. The old search system, which you see is a very dangerous drop, as you can see at the left side here, to the new system, which is less dangerous in a way. Well, the conclusion. Of course, in my field, Second World War, for us, it's very important that these stories about the Second World War are told to future generations. And those future generations are, of course, digital. So the way to get them involved is to try to find ways to approach them by offering digital services at a really low access way. And we think that if you go into those resources and you see those personal stories, and also the stories of the locations, that it is a very powerful means to appeal to especially these user groups, but also to the general audience. Of course, the eyewitnesses are not there anymore in our case, and the source materials take over this role of these eyewitnesses. So it's important to really make sure that these source materials are in the digital domain, because if they are not, for many people, they won't exist. Well, getting back to this picture, I think for me, there are really exciting things happening in the middle part. Still, the fact that you will never be able to reconstruct this historical reality, but I think these means will extend our toolbox and give us more ways to make analysis, to provide information, to also make archives interesting for a general audience. And I think, as a historian, for me, I think it's very interesting to see that what I'm actually trying to do in these collection projects is to make the public a bit of an historian, and try to get them as much interested in this historical information as I am. So my own passion should actually, I hope that they will be kind of inflamed by my own passion for this material, and in the end also my own passion for these stories in a way. So, and one of the things, well, of course, there are many people with digital humanities background here, so I don't have to say this to you, but to some historians, this is also something important to mention, that the computers are not a threat. I think they can be your best friends, but it's important to tell them how to do that. So that's basically my work, I guess. So thank you very much for your attention, and well, I'm open for discussion or questions.